Hi students, welcome back. I hope that you found that short clip informative and also an interesting way, a useful way to reiterate some of the key ideas from the first part of this lecture. So let's go ahead and go back to where we were and wrap up our lecture on neoliberalism. Okay. So you just saw a great overview of neoliberalism that brought to life some of the cast of characters that we had looked at and talked about in the first lecture on neoliberalism, the first part of the lecture. Some of these key figures being Friedrich von Hayek. We have Milton Friedman here. These are some of the key architects of neoliberalism, and then how neoliberalism and the ideas of these two men really refuted some of the key ideas of John Maynard Keynes. Okay, so that's most certainly where we were. I hope that video was useful for you. All right, so let me share my screen. So here we are. We were just talking about Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, and of course how their ideas of their neoliberal ideas of how to run an economy, which became popular, which became hegemonic, the dominant idea, the taken for granted sense idea after the 1970s, 1980 to 2008. These ideas were very different than the ideas of John Maynard Keynes and his economic theory of Keynesianism that dominated the World War II period, from World War II period until the 1970s, okay? So let's pick back up where we left off now that I'm properly sharing my screen. I guess maybe I'm not. Here we go, folks. All right. So we have been focusing on this history of neoliberalism as one chapter in the history of globalization, right? Certainly thinking about how the United States and Britain and other first world economies were run during this period post-World War II to the 1970s. This was Keynesianism, the period of Keynesianism. And I talked quite a bit in the last lecture about that, so I won't go over that again. But again, you know, this neoliberalism is not new. It's a revival of a previous era in which states, it was a moment of colonialism, in which states and colonial states in particular really believed in the idea of comparative advantage, of global economic integration, and laissez-faire, the invisible hand of the market. Okay, so let's just go ahead and keep moving forward here. Okay, but one of the things that we have talked about, not as deeply as I would like, is the role of economic crisis in spurring these shifts from liberalism to protectionism, or what we're calling Keynesianism, to liberalism again. And once more, we seem to be in a period in which ideas about using quotas and tariffs to protect not only the American economy, but nations around the world are engaging in more of these protectionist measures. So neoliberalism, as the video so beautifully captured, accurately captured, has come under threat because the housing crisis of 2008, which was a product in large part of slicing and dicing mortgages and loans on a global level, the deregulation of the financial markets globally, that was a hallmark of the 1980s. That system, that sort of the risk that the packaging and bundling, the securitization of mortgages, et cetera, that's not important for our sake, but what we have to understand is that the buying and selling of money and loans became huge under neoliberalism because a lot of the regulations on financial capital were reduced. That's the hallmark of neoliberalism, deregulate. And what happened was basically that system imploded in 2008, starting with the housing market, and then that economic crisis spread to other markets. Okay, so the video captures that we now are in a period in which neoliberalism, its hegemony, its power, its taken for granted status has come under threat. But I want you to understand not just the sort of role of the 2008 crisis, but let's talk for just a minute about what happens in 1973 and 1979 from a sort of satellite view to understand this argument that the shift back and forth between liberalism and protectionism as economic ideologies is often spurred by conflict, by crisis, by economic crisis. So let's look at what created the economic crisis of the 1970s. Okay. Let me just sort of see what I've got. I have a question for myself here. Just a minute. Okay. Okay. So what role did the 1973 and 79 global oil crises and recession play in spreading neoliberal reforms globally? Well, the argument here is that the period of the 1970s, the economic recession that was created by two, not one, but two global economic oil crisis, that created the conditions that enabled the Mount Pelerin Society, the disciples, of neoliberalism to advocate for neoliberal economic reforms around the world. So in 1973, OPEC, the Organization of Oil Producing and Exporting Countries, placed an embargo on oil production that increased oil prices dramatically. Okay, this was in retaliation for many Western countries supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And basically what OPEC is, it's a group of oil producing countries, largely based out of the Middle East, but it also includes Russia. And what they did was they got together in 1973, OPEC, this organization, and they artificially manipulated the price of oil. They put an embargo on oil production. They stopped producing oil. The cost of oil skyrocketed, okay? And it sent the global economy into a recession. Now, the United States, later we learned that the United States have threatened to invade Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi to get the flow of oil going again. And of course, oil is important because the entire economy is run on oil. It's transportation, it's energy. So if the cost of oil goes up, the cost of everything goes up. All right, our economy is dependent on oil. So the price of oil really impacts the economy in very rapid and profound ways. Okay, well, the Saudis agreed under threat of US invasion to begin to place all of the money, the dollars, the money that was made on the soaring cost of oil. They agreed that they would put all of their dollars, often called petrodollars, the money generated from the global oil industry, into New York investment banks. Now, this made New York investment banks flush with cash that they could then lend to make money off of. But at the time, in the 1970s, there were a lot of restrictions on the movement of money across international lines. Okay, so these companies, they had a lot of money to lend, but they were constrained by regulations with their ability to lend money. And then what's interesting is that in 1979, not only do we have the Volcker shock, which is known as the moment in which the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, he raised interest rates in the United States in 1979 in order to reduce inflation at all costs, okay? So if you remember from last lecture, I explained that under Keynesian economics, under economic protectionism, that economic ideology, Keynesianism, that dominated the US economy up until the 1970s. Interest rates were always kept very low in the hopes that it would stimulate borrowing to help keep employment as full as possible, very much sort of the state intervention. But Volcker decides to go against Keynesian economic theory and implement neoliberal ideas. He raises interest rates with the idea that inflation must be reduced at all costs, right? That inflation is bad for the economy, that inflation, the sort of devaluation of money becomes worth less, was a reflection of the sort of monetarism, the supply side economic of Keynesianism. So Volcker, who's chairman of the Federal Reserve, really begins to implement neoliberal policies in the United States. And what happens is, of course, that when interest rates are raised, it does create further difficulty and further recession in the United States and around the world. But before we talk about what happens with raising interest rates in the United States in 1979 and how that impacts what happens in Mexico, I just want to also flag that in addition to the oil crisis of 73, there was a second oil crisis of 79. So a lot of these drivers of economic recession weren't just about sort of unions demanding too much money or states being inefficient, which is one of the arguments of neoliberalism, but that that OPEC was involved in OPEC countries were involved in geopolitical struggle in the Middle East and were using oil as a mechanism, a tactic of indirect warfare, right? So in 1973, remind yourself, there was an oil crisis that began in 73 when members of OPEC had an embargo. The embargo targeted nations supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. By the end of the embargo in March of 74, price of oil had raised from 400% from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. Wow. Imagine the impact on the economy. The cost of everything went up. Right? And then again in 79, there's a second oil crisis or an oil shock that occurred due to decreased oil output in the wake of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Okay, so the price of oil doubled. We'll come back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979 in a couple of weeks, but what I want you to understand is that there were two major oil crises, the oil crisis of 73 and then the second oil crisis of 1979. And as the global economy was going through recession and difficulty due to these rising oil costs, which created a lot of problems all over the world, Paul Volcker in 1979, as we were just saying, chairman of the Federal Reserve, decides for the first time ever to rise interest rates in order to try to stop the stagflation, the stagnation of the stagnation, of the economy, as well as inflation, money getting less and less value, more and more dollars for the same thing, right? Inflation. And so he raises interest rates. And interest rates went through the roof. My parents explained to me that, after sort of this moment in the late 1970s, the early 1980s, they were paying mortgage rates in the double digits, 15, 18% mortgage rates in the United States. Right now, mortgage rates are closer to 3 or 4%. So interest rates just rose in attempts to keep inflation down. Neoliberal theory let the market do its thing, the invisible hand. Well, what happened was a lot of third world countries, remember third world countries who really participated in and believed in the idea of modernization, of development. They thought that if they copied the path or tried to follow the path of capitalist development of the United States, that they would modernize, that it would reduce poverty. This was the project of development, right? Spreading capitalist development, USA style, to third world countries as a poverty alleviation project. But in order to do a lot of the modernization and the infrastructure building, these third world countries borrowed money. And they borrowed money from US banks, which had a lot of money after 1973 because the Saudis were depositing all of the oil revenue in the form of dollars into New York investment banks. And the New York investment banks, really under the conditions of neoliberalism that are emerging, are advocating for the deregulation of international finance, which of course allowed them to loan large amounts of money. We're talking like big oil money, right? billions of dollars of loans, not to private companies, but to third world governments that seemed like a safer bet. But what happened was, after the oil crises of 73 and then 79, and then the rising interest rates, what happened was countries found themselves, not just my parents, but countries found their interest rates going from 3 or 4% to 18, 20%. And if any of you have ever had a credit card where you have paid 18% interest on your debt, you know that you'll be paying huge sums of money just to service that debt. Well, this is essentially the story that we're going to be looking at on Wednesday. I'm giving you a bit of a preview here. The idea is that many of the loans that third world countries had taken out to finance development, to finance modernization, to finance industrialization, the interest rates on those loans in the late 1970s, early 1980s skyrocketed. And countries like Mexico and countries around the world found that they were paying half of their annual GDP just to service their international debt costs. And in 1982, Mexico said, we can't do it. We can't service this international debt, all of this debt that we have, this money that we have borrowed to finance development through the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. That whole system came crashing down, and Mexico said to its international creditors, we can't pay, we default. And this is where the International Monetary Fund stepped in. If you remember, we made the argument before the break that the IMF was created at the Bretton Woods Conference in the 1940s as an international bank that would provide short-term loans or bailouts to national governments in the hopes of preventing a great global depression like the one the world saw in 1929. The idea was that Mexico could be bailed out by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, so that the economic crisis in Mexico didn't trigger a global economic crisis. So the IMF steps in and says, well, you can't default. You're a country. That would create an economic catastrophe. What we're going to do is bail you out. We're going to refinance your loans. The IMF is going to refinance your private loans on the conditions that you implement neoliberal economic reforms. You've got to slash your spending. You've got to cut your expenditures in public health. You've got to privatize your state-owned industries. Basically, the debt crisis that was the product of the global oil crises of the 1970s, the debt crisis of the 1980s, created a situation in which the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which now was practicing neoliberal ideas as part of its orthodoxy, part of its toolkit, its assumption of the best way to run the economy, and it forced third world countries to open up their economy through structural adjustment policies. Structural adjustment policies, SAPs, were conditions on the loans that the IMF gave countries like Mexico in 1982 to bail them out of this debt crisis that they found themselves in, paying international creditors 19-20% interest on these enormous loans. So we're going to come back to structural adjustment policies. Structural adjustment policies were the means by which neoliberal reform happened in third world countries, and the means by which third world countries in the 1970s and 80s were forcibly, through the mechanism of debt, restructured, reintegrated into the global economy. Okay. So we'll come back to structural adjustment. That's warming us up for next class. Okay, so let's talk about these neoliberal policies. Sorry, folks. We've got 3 slides left. Hang in there. I appreciate your patience. Okay, so what are some of the examples of neoliberal policy? Well, neoliberalism is all about privatization, right? Privatization of state enterprises, deregulation of the market, free markets, the ideology of free markets is best, all those things we talked about in lecture 1, and a reduction in state spending, slash that spending. The video that you're going to be watching on Wednesday, Life and Debt, is a story about how neoliberal reforms unfolded in Jamaica through the experience of structural adjustment. We're going to come on to this idea of structural adjustment policies. That's the focus, how neoliberalism impacted third world countries and how the bailout loans from the IMF, which is a consequence of the oil crisis of 73 and 79 and the big borrowing and big spending of third world countries pursuing development. That's the focus of our next lecture, but I do want to talk a little bit about how neoliberalism has impacted the United States before we head to the developing world. So, policies of market liberalization, right? We've been talking about liberalism, free market, laissez-faire, right? The state should not, according to neoliberal theory, be interfering as heavily as it did under Keynesianism to regulate prices, unemployment levels, etc. The promotion of free trade is the hallmark of neoliberal economic thought. Liberalization of foreign direct investment, right? Opening up your economies to foreign ownership of businesses and resources. That's the opposite of economic nationalism, right? Reductions in state spending for education, welfare, Social Security, and Medicare. In the United States, there were dramatic budget cuts to education, funding for education, and we have seen the cost of education skyrocket. That's driven by a lot of factors, but certainly the federal government is not paying as much of state tuition as it has in the past when we account for inflation, etc. Welfare to work programs. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration started putting strict requirements on welfare recipients, this idea that money should be slashed in terms of the provision of those services. And another key piece of neoliberalism, particularly in the United States, was that the deregulation of the movement of money, the deregulation and the promotion of these free trade agreements resulted in, and the liberalization of FDI, foreign direct investment. It meant that a lot of American companies relocated in third world countries like Mexico, like Guatemala, like Vietnam. Look at the back of your t-shirt. Where was it born? Or where was your t-shirt born? Where was your t-shirt made? The funny thing is that, 50 years ago, the majority of clothes were made here in the United States. Now they're made abroad. This is a reflection of what's happened in all sorts of manufacturing sectors, not just clothing, but also automobiles. The United States used to produce the majority of automobiles that Americans drove. That is no longer the case. I don't know exactly if it's majority or what the percentage is. But what's interesting is that even American cars, Ford cars, right? Relocation of those cars moved away from Detroit, moved away from that old industrial heartland of car manufacturing to Mexico and right along the Mexican-American border, where companies are taking advantage of the cheap labor, the lack of environmental regulations, and oftentimes the violence against unions and any democratic efforts to raise the cost of labor and labor conditions in third world countries. So many manufacturing companies relocated in this new global economy, this neoliberal global economy that facilitated this type of international production, right? A lot of US manufacturing jobs went to the global south. And a lot of Americans are pretty unhappy with that because the type of jobs that replace them, largely service sector jobs, haven't been as high paying. And certainly those manufacturing jobs provided living wages to working class individuals. You could make a good middle class earning in manufacturing and that didn't require a college degree or even a master's degree. And today, those good paying jobs are not as available. And we're going to look at some statistics on the distribution of wealth. Some other ideas, examples of neoliberal policies: and deregulation of environmental protections, lost union power. So there was a key moment in the early 1980s and 81 when the Air Traffic Controllers Union struck. And Reagan stepped in, intervened, and fired them all. And this is seen as sort of a key blow to the union movement. That was also exacerbated by the fact that first world companies could now, rather than dealing with US unions and manufacturing of whether it's clothes or automobiles, and could relocate to Mexico, Guatemala, Vietnam, Cambodia. Look at the back of your shirt, where oftentimes military dictatorships use violence to suppress union organizing. That certainly is the case in Central America. Not today, but in the past. Privatization of state-owned companies. The US government used to own, state government, local government would own water and sewer companies, waste management. That has all been privatized. Telecommunication. The government used to have basically a monopoly on a lot of telecommunication technology. That's all been privatized, meaning now that the state doesn't own your garbage company, or the local government doesn't own the garbage company. It's owned by a private company. Reducing taxes for the upper class and corporate tax breaks. This is part of the idea of trickle-down economics. This is the hallmark of liberalism, right? That you rise all boats and it's going to be good for everybody. That if you benefit the richest class, the wealthiest class, by not taxing them, they'll reinvest that money in the market, which will produce more jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, what we've seen today is that oftentimes when companies make a lot of money, they don't put it in expanding R&D or production. They do stock buybacks and other things to generate wealth in the financial sector, which is all about making money on money. Rather than employing people per se, right? So these are some of the key ideas. Now, what have been the consequences of neoliberalism? This is also taking a glance, looking ahead here. We have what I've already flagged is the experience of structural adjustment policies and neoliberal reforms in the third world, okay? And the long and the short of it is that many critics argue that structural adjustment policies, which are neoliberal policies implemented as conditions for debt restructuring in the 1980s, but they put the control of third world economies back into the hands of first world nations through forcing those countries to allow foreign direct investment, privatizing state-owned industries. Obviously, foreign companies could buy those state-owned industries. And so the experience of structural adjustment in the third world has been hard. Water resources have been privatized. People have fought that because companies have operating with the goal of profit rather than providing a public good, have increased prices. There was a lot of public backlash in the so-called third world about these neoliberal reforms because it made life hard for a lot of people. Cuts in healthcare spending, cuts in education. So we're going to be thinking about structural adjustment policies and the impacts of neoliberalism in the third world in our next lecture. In the United States, neoliberalism has corresponded with a dramatic increase in wealth inequality. Here we have a graph from Harvey's book, The Attack on Labor. Look at real wages and productivity. What's so interesting about what's happened under the United States economy under neoliberalism is that productivity has increased dramatically. This is dollars per hour in terms of productivity of the US economy. But what happens is wages have not increased. In fact, real wages today have not moved since the 1970s, since the beginning of neoliberal reforms, right? So while some folks have been making a lot of money in the neoliberal economy, by and large, that wealth has been concentrated at the top the top tiers of the US economy, which has motivated a lot of people to critique this idea that the 1% has the vast majority of the wealth, or that there's growing economic inequality. But in actuality, there has been, up until during this period of Keynesianism, we saw productivity increase with real wages, the amount of money that workers got paid, right? So wages, the average wage in 1973 was $15.72. In today's dollars, it's actually less than that, on par with. So people who are in working class jobs are making the same amount of money that they were in the 1970s, but yet sort of the CEO, the corporate sector, they've seen their salaries increase seemingly exponentially. Okay, so this graph is getting at what we are going to look at towards the end of our course, which is the problem of income inequality, vast income inequality at a global scale, which is part of the United States experience as well. And we already talked a little bit about the global recession of 2008. We'll come back to that a little bit later, setting us up for looking forward. And the combination of the global recession of 2008 and this growing inequality, which is a product of neoliberal economic reforms, whereby the state is not taxing, not redistributing this money, that the combination of the recession and growing inequality has motivated a lot of people to question the benefits of globalization, which we're really talking about here, neoliberal globalization, right? The experience of globalization since 1970s, 80, 90, 2000, right? So we're seeing, again, sort of an end to that moment, or at least a questioning of the benefits of the global economy for most folks. All right, so thank you so much for being patient with me on these lectures on neoliberalism. I know I gave you a lot of information. I look forward to speaking to you in office hours on Thursday, and I'll send out an email here shortly with a little more information on how you can access that documentary I'm asking you to watch. Okay, so warmest regards to all. I hope you're all doing well. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions on the lecture.